So I'm just going to talk through a little bit about the sort of my practice, a little bit about the sorts of things. Well, in fact, there's lots of synergies and lots of correlations between what Mark started as off thinking about, and again, I think what Miriam was picking up on. But I kind of go off on a bit of a slight tangent in some places. So I'm just going to sort of share with you some of the sorts of practice, some of the sorts of methodologies, some of my sorts of understandings as an artist. And you may remember, some of you, that back in November, I think during the issues, Annie and I talked about artistic practice and galleries and museums, and I talked a little bit about my practice then as an artist, as a researcher, and as a teacher, or as an artist teacher. And in the bottom left-hand corner is the paper that I used at that point, or just to remind you that that's possibly a more in-depth kind of overview of some of these things that would sort of make sense. So on the right hand side is some recent films I've been working on, which are based in a they were shown in a gallery in Japan, in Tsukuba, and it was based around a residency with an international group of artists. And what's quite nice about that is that that's one of those kinds of forums, one of those kinds of areas that I've been sort of working with and working on in terms of this approach of mine, and how I understand myself as an artist, as an educator, as a collaborator, as a kind of a role model, and also as perhaps an activist, along with this notion of being an artist researcher, or more often I call myself more of an inquirer. And so a lot of my kind of work, a lot of the projects I've developed sort of help participants develop and think about their own creativity, and encourage them to sort of critically reflect on their activities, on my activities, on the activities that we do together. And so I think that kind of idea of engaging with participants primarily for me through discussion and the exchanging of ideas and exchanging of experiences forms the kind of evidence that I use for that kind of co-construction of learning, where we share knowledge, share what's been generated, where I play a kind of a co-learner, and that's very crucial to me. I see my own practice, in terms of a kind of a continuum where things come backwards and forwards, where knowledge isn't necessarily transmitted, but is more of a kind of, as I say, an experiential kind of dialogue moment for giving emphasis for opportunities in different types of supportive environments. And I'll mention some of those different kinds of environments a bit later. But certainly, seeing that sort of collaborative aspect as being really important by its very nature, and certainly something that's been very desirable for me from sort of really early on, where I worked as an artist in industry, and I realized an artist in residency, where I realized it was the collaborative aspect, it was the dialogic aspect of what I was doing that was equally as important as the making. And that's kind of filtered through all of my teaching, whatever context of teaching I found myself in. And I've worked across sort of secondary schools, FE, HE as well. So thinking about the sort of role model aspect as well, I think that's kind of increasingly been more recent through the educational aspect, but also when I've been engaging with artists and sort of critiquing and sort of thinking about problem solving, and thinking about the way that you can be perceived, the way that we engage, a little bit about, I suppose, what Miriam was talking about there, sort of thinking about those relationships, about your sort of how you engage and the ways that you engage with others in the process of making. And I think that's kind of been really interesting when I've worked internationally with other artists, and thinking about the relationships about practice, and thinking about those kinds of different pedagogical sort of ways of working. And I talk a little bit about sort of social activism in terms of, I suppose, thinking about the social and the political issues that are kind of enable me to engage and articulate and work with different groups, to sort of also kind of give voice. A lot of the times, some of the things I've done have been about the importance of encouraging and giving voice, and reflecting and thinking on this kind of, thinking about this particular element. And then, as I said, sort of the last bit is something that's really kind of very much about the kind of contexts and the different sort of forums and the different sorts of ways, not just within the university, within gallery spaces, but also within studio spaces, and sort of within sort of residency spaces. So it kind of also sort of marries with what Miriam was saying there about these kind of quite often sort of non sort of formal, almost messy kind of spaces. So there's a quick overview of the sorts of reference points, I suppose, for people to sort of go and think about and look at in terms of the reading, in terms of the understanding. So as I suppose an artist sort of teacher, my practice sort of is based around art education. It's based around the visual art practice as research, as Mark mentioned, but it's also around making, and I think making is really perhaps more key to me than perhaps where Mark and Miriam position themselves, where they tend to think more about other aspects, and Mark particularly perhaps making is more about curating as and spaces, rather than making as I would sort of refer to it. And the second aspect is the sort of transdisciplinarity, again similar, or the interdisciplinarity was I think the term Miriam used. I quite like trans, but that's something else. And then the notion of collaborative and the dialogic approach to that, which kind of underpins. And my artistic practice is based in a number of areas. It includes sculpture. Sculpture was my first degree, fine art sculpture, but also I use a lot of film, as you've seen from the first sort of slide. I use objects. I make things, as you can see from my own brain here, that I made from an MRI scan that I had taken. I make prints. I also work in installations. I work kind of in situ quite often. So it's a kind of a range of different sorts of what I would call concepts that are based around artful inquiry and my own practice, and I use these concepts and I use these models as a kind of a generative way, similar to Mark, thinking about generative in terms of knowledge. And I raise questions around personally situated knowledge and production as a kind of a strategy, thinking about those cross-disciplinary borders of science, of art, of education, and in my case walking or making, as well as a kind of a different element to that. As I mentioned, I use hosted spaces. I like to sort of different types of spaces to have those displays, those opportunities for making or showing and displaying, and they function to engage, I think, and thereby generate dialogue between maybe scientists, artists, educators, whatever. I've used neuroscientists in the past. I've used sort of doctors. I've worked with a number of different kinds of fields, which I think creates a nice transdisciplinary, generating in a kind of Foucaultian way conversations about ways of seeing, ways of being, certainly in terms of me, in terms of sort of learning and knowledge, and certainly in relationship to brain. So they're all very collaborative, knowledge production, sort of multi-perspective ways of working with hopefully unanticipated knowledge. And that seems to be very much the sorts of ways that I've worked in the past. I'm not going to go through those, but they're there if you want to sort of look at in greater detail some of these different approaches and different sorts of aspects of how I weave together. And I think that's a really nice term, and I use that sort of Denzin and Lincoln notion of a researcher as a bricoleur, somebody that weaves, somebody that brings together, sort of somebody that sort of uses like a patchwork, like a mosaic of multi-perspectives, of a way of kind of guiding inquiry. It's not very neat, it's quite messy, as Miriam would indicate. It's not neatly bound as a paradigm that you necessarily find easily to sort of work with, but I think it brings that kind of bricoleur notion, brings a richness. It brings a kind of an aspect that I think is really important to my own practice, in way that we construct and bring materials together, and way that we're able to make sense, and we are able to sort of move our considerations. So texts. One of the texts I just wanted to flag, which I think is really quite nice and useful for people to think about, is by a Canadian professor, Rita Irvin, who coined this term artography, and it's this text in particular is quite interesting because it brings together 12 different stories of artists, teachers, who and researchers who sort of use different ways to explore visual art and how that kind of engage with meaning making of representation and educational research. I think the book kind of sort of treats, I suppose, the whole process of research as around kind of that relationship between the artist and teacher inquiry. I think primarily it talks about things that I've talked about before, which is about artistic practice as research, but it really nicely brings some of the theory, it brings some of the visual art practice and texts in a nice kind of narrative, a nice story, and it's quite easy to read. As I say, it puts the different sorts of models and different sort of practice together in a nice kind of center around inquiry. But importantly, it puts self at the core. And I'll talk a little bit about self and that relationship to self and research when we talk about action research. The second text I just wanted to flag was Sullivan, an Australian who's been writing about this for a number of years, and really sort of I would say seminal text in terms of thinking about making a compelling argument about creative and cultural inquiry that's undertaken by artists as research. Lots of different themes, lots of different practice, again, lots of different contexts of this inquiry. But what's really nice is it sort of talks a little bit about what Miriam was saying about sort of the idea of discourse within research and praxis, and putting oneself in that sort of putting oneself in that picture, and it legitimizes something that's quite often sometimes difficult to explain in the academia, that relationship between your own practice and making. And I think also what's nice about this text is it theorizes and sort of emphasizes the role of imaginative, intellectual, creating, criticizing and constructing knowledge that kind of is at odds to the normal sort of logic, scientific kind of way that we in society frame understanding and knowing. And so I think it's a nice text in sort of raising that sort of aspect of practice. And then finally, again, two kind of seminal texts that I think are really helpful in terms of helping anybody that's working with visual, anybody that's working with visual material. It's quite a practical guide again, and sort of really nice expert sort of theoretical orientation, and able to help people to think about their approach, to think about how we interpret visual culture. And there's lots of things in there that ranges from film right through to photography, websites, social media. It's not just what we would think of as kind of more traditional art forms, but it's a really nice sort of interdisciplinary, post-disciplinary kind of text that helps you sort of think about the kind of concerns. It helps you position, I suppose, some of those kinds of practices that are a little bit tricky sometimes in other fields. So there's a quick breakdown of the more recent exhibitions that kind of give you a sense of what I get up to and where I am at different points. I don't need to say too much about that, other than that you can see from the range of institutions, some of them are quite reasonably big, some of them are more learning environments, some of them are more kind of centres, and some of these are based in sort of out of residences, and the residences are a part of the exhibiting and the practice. Here are some of the themes that I've worked with and continue to work with over my making, based around, as I said, knowledge production. Some of the earliest stuff was very much about the and still is, I suppose, about the relationship to cognition, about perception, about understandings, and lots of this has come through my collaboration with neuroscientists. And you can see the rather lovely and sexy Professor Anil Seth from Sussex University, who's too pretty to be a scientist, but never mind. And then you'll also sort of see some of the sort of work that's about embodiment. A lot of the stuff that I've been doing recently that explores that relationship between the tacit, the embodied knowing, knowledge generation, some of the stuff that I've been doing about walking. And then more recently, if anybody's been keeping an eye on the sort of stuff that I've done on social media, you'll notice I've been sort of looking at the kind of COVID situation, lockdown, being on your own, thinking about isolations, thinking about the ordinary, the everyday, and the infraordinary, a term that Mark introduced me to very recently, which has been really kind of an important part of some of my recent sort of practice and thinking. I'm going to summarize now because I'm coming to the end of my time, and so that makes sense just to wrap this up. I think this is just a cross section of some of the things. I have an alter ego as a scientist. I am clearly not a scientist, but I do like to sort of think about my alter ego when I'm having conversations about different ways of understanding and different ways of being. So I play those out. I sort of make practice. And as you can see, I've been doing this for a long time because there is Darwin. So I've been doing it for a very long time, perhaps since the Victorian times. And then I suppose, yeah, more recently on the right-hand side, I've been thinking about my hands, and I've been thinking about that kind of relationship to production and hands, and importantly touch, and importantly to this kind of understanding of materials and space and people, and obviously the issues with COVID and the emphasis on the hands as being they're demonized as kind of the spreaders of disease, and so it's quite interesting when we kind of look at those kinds of messages that we're and the different understandings that we've had or receiving. And so I've been doing some stuff with a collaboration with a colleague in the studio, and we've been sort of trying to work our way around this idea of relationships and practice making and certainly hands. And there's a whole series of rather odd hand washing exercises on my website that I've been doing, sort of where we've been sort of trying to wash each other's hands in a kind of in a way that's kind of trying to be symbiotic, but clearly is very bad because we don't really know each other very well, and it's kind of oddly awkward and tense and oddly sort of a power sort of struggle dynamic, because she's left-handed, I'm right-handed, and she wants to be sort of in leading, and so it's a really kind of interesting sort of commentary. Feel free to have a look at some of the everyday stuff about practice, which you'll see on Instagram and the blogging that takes place on the website. That just kind of gives you a more up-to-date and yeah, more sort of recent picture of what I do.